The universe had forgotten the name of humanity, and that was how the people of the Candlewood wanted it. Their world was not a planet, but a vessel, a great, spidery construct of aging metal in glowing conduits that had been anchored in the throat of the Seraphim Nebula for 500 years. It was a lighthouse at the end of space, tending a beam of coherent light that cut through the swirling, violent gases, a single point of stability in a storm of creation and destruction. To the 100,000 souls aboard, it was the whole of existence, a self-sustaining city ship whose first and only commandment was to keep the light burning. The stories told to children were of a great cataclysm, a fire that had consumed the old human empire on 1,000 worlds, leaving only their small ark to drift into this quiet corner of the galaxy to serve out their penitence. They were keepers, a monastic society of engineers and archivists, their lives governed by the steady, metronomic pulse of the great beacon at the station's heart. Kalen was an archivist of the lower decks, a young man whose world was the hum of data stacks and the scent of dust and ozone. His job was to preserve the past, but the past was a ghost, a collection of fragmented logs and corrupted files that spoke of star-spanning fleets and terrible, silent weapons. He curated whispers of an empire called the Terran Dominion and its enemies, the names of which were like curses on the tongue, but none of it felt real. It was mythology, as distant as the creation myths the elders recited during the solstice ceremonies. His reality was the cold metal under his feet, the recycled air in his lungs, and the suffocating peace of the Candlewood. It was a peace he had begun to resent, a placid silence that felt less like tranquility and more like a tomb. The silence broke not with a bang, but with a discordant hum at the edge of hearing, a psychic static that gnawed at the quiet hours of the deep cycle. It started in the outer rings, among the sensor technicians and the void riggers. They called it the whisper, a faint, disquieting resonance that clung to their thoughts like cobwebs. They complained of nightmares, of seeing fleeting shadows in their peripheral vision, of a growing, baseless paranoia that made them eye their neighbors with suspicion. The station's MedCorps diagnosed it as a new strain of space sickness, a product of generations spent in the nebula's strange radiation. But Kalen knew it was something more. He felt it too, a pressure behind his eyes, a feeling of being watched by a million unseen eyes from the swirling, purple clouds beyond the station's viewports. Then came the first breakdown. A veteran engineer, a man who had serviced the beacon's primary lens for 50 years, calmly walked into his workshop, sealed the doors, and began to meticulously disassemble his own body with a plasma cutter, his face serene as he did so. He left no note, only a chilling phrase smeared in his own blood on the wall. "The silence is coming." The phrase spread through the station like a virus, whispered in mess halls and habitation blocks. The psychic static grew louder, becoming a murmur, a chorus of unintelligible voices that seemed to promise both oblivion and ecstasy. Productivity plummeted. Arguments flared into fistfights over imagined slights. People began talking to themselves, their eyes unfocused, their minds clearly somewhere else, lost in a dialogue with the growing noise. A creeping madness was bleeding through the bulkheads of their small, orderly world. The station's ruling council, the elders, tasked Kalen with a desperate, secret task to dive deep into the uncorrupted archives, the shielded deep storage vaults that held the most forbidden knowledge of their ancestors, and find any reference to a psychic plague, a madness that could be transmitted across the void. For weeks, Kalen lived in the cold, humming heart of the archive, surrounded by the ghosts of a humanity he could barely comprehend. He found fragmented battle reports from a conflict known as the Mind Wars, detailing a foe that used no ships or weapons, only the power of a collective consciousness to overwhelm and consume its victims. They were called the Silenti, and the logs described them not as creatures, but as a condition, a psychic entropy that unraveled sentient thought. They didn't kill, they erased. They absorbed the consciousness of their victims, adding their memories and experiences to their silent, collective whole, leaving behind nothing but empty, placid shells. The few coherent reports described entire worlds falling silent in a matter of days, their population simply ceasing to be. The last transmissions filled not with screams of terror, but with sighs of peaceful surrender. The ancient Terran Dominion had fought them to a standstill using horrific weapons of their own, psychic armaments that shattered minds and broke the laws of physics, weapons so terrible that their use was deemed a greater sin than extinction. While Kalen searched, the Candlewood was dying. Void riggers began untethering themselves and drifting into the beautiful, lethal clouds of the nebula. In the hydroponic bays, cultivators drowned themselves in the irrigation tanks. The station's central plaza, and once a place of quiet community, became a gallery of horrors, with people standing frozen for hours, their faces slack, as tears streaming from their vacant eyes as the Silenti feasted on their minds. The static was a roar now, a constant, crushing wave of psychic energy that made coherent thought an act of sheer will. Kalen could feel them, the Silenti, their presence a vast, cold hunger in the void beyond the hull. They had no ships in the conventional sense, just patches of absolute blackness that drifted slowly toward the station, voids in space that swallowed the light of the nebula and reflected nothing. They were coming not to conquer the Candlewood, but to drink from it. His search finally led him to a single, heavily encrypted file, locked under the personal seal of the station's first keeper, Admiral Valerius Kane. The file was not a report, it was a confession. Admiral Kane revealed that the Candlewood was a lie. It wasn't an ark of survivors fleeing a cataclysm. It was a prison, a cage built to contain a weapon. The Great Beacon, the light they had tended for centuries, was not a navigational aid. It was a lock, a complex energy field designed to suppress and contain what lay in the station's sealed and shielded core, the Noctis engine. The engine was the last of the Dominion's psychic superweapons, a device capable of broadcasting a single, targeted psychic frequency of such immense power that it could resonate with the hive mind of a species like the Silenti and shatter it into a billion screaming, individual fragments, destroying them utterly. The broadcast was codenamed The Scream. Kane's confession was chilling. He wrote of how the Dominion, in its final, desperate days, had unleashed the Scream upon the Silenti homeworld, an act of psychic genocide that had not only wiped out their enemy, but had also echoed back through the fabric of space-time, causing catastrophic damage to the minds of anyone with even latent psychic ability across half the galaxy, including millions of humans. The weapon was too dangerous to destroy and too powerful to leave behind. So Kane and his loyalists had fled, taking the Noctis engine with them, and built the Candlewood around it. They created a new society, a peaceful monastic order of keepers, and erased their own history, burying the truth under layers of myth and ritual so that no one would ever be tempted to unleash that power again. The Great Cataclysm wasn't something that had happened to humanity. It was something humanity had done. Kalen felt the blood drain from his face. His entire life, his entire culture, was a carefully constructed deception designed to guard a doomsday weapon. He took the discovery to Elder Lyra, the head of the council and his mentor. He found her in the primary observation dome, her face pale and drawn, watching as one of the black, starless voids of a Silenti vessel eclipsed a nearby star. She was one of the few who seemed able to resist the psychic onslaught. Her mind, a fortress of disciplined calm. When Kaylin presented the data slate with Kane's confession, she did not look surprised. She simply nodded, her ancient eyes filled with a profound sorrow. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the psychic roar. "The truth has always been kept by the elders. We had hoped it would never be needed." She explained that the station was now the last bastion of thought in this sector. The Silenti were converging, drawn to the concentrated consciousness of 100,000 minds. The station's outer defenses, its physical shields and turrets, were useless against an enemy that could simply phase through the hull like ghosts. Their only hope, their only weapon, was the one their ancestors had fled from. But activating the Noctis engine was not as simple as flipping a switch. The scream was not an automated broadcast. It needed to be focused, shaped, and guided by a living mind, a human consciousness willing to act as the focal point for an unimaginable torrent of psychic energy. This conductor would have to interface directly with the engine's core matrix, a process that would inevitably destroy their own mind, shattering their sanity and identity under the strain. Furthermore, the engine's matrix was not empty. To ensure the weapon would only be used with the full, brutal understanding of its purpose, Admiral Valerius Kane had imprinted a copy of his own consciousness into its core before his death, the mind of a ruthless, genocidal military commander, a man who had willingly ordered the psychic annihilation of an entire species. Whoever interfaced with the engine would have to battle this ghost for control, to become one with a monster to wield a monstrous power. "For 500 years, Freund, we have trained," Lyra said, her gaze fixed on Kaylin. "Every elder has undergone mental conditioning, strengthening our psychic resilience, preparing for the day the silence returned. But this wave is too strong. None of us could withstand the interface for more than a second." Kaylin understood then. He saw it in her tired, desperate eyes. His skepticism, his cynicism, his constant questioning of the station's dogma had not been a flaw. It had been a shield. While others had minds built on faith and community, his was built on doubt and logic, a mind that had unintentionally fortified itself against the psychic whisperings of the Silenti. He was an anomaly, an outcast in his own society, and now he was its only hope. "You are asking me to sacrifice myself," Kaylin said, his voice hollow. "Worse," Lyra corrected gently. "I am asking you to become a weapon, to let the mind of a man who committed genocide into your own, and to pull the trigger on a gun that our people swore would never be fired again." Outside, the psychic pressure intensified, the very air seeming to thicken. Kaylin could feel the Silenti probing at the edges of his mind, their cold, hungry thoughts promising an end to struggle, an end to pain, a blissful dissolution into their silent chorus. He saw the faces of his friends, his neighbors, their minds being stripped away, their souls being consumed. He thought of the engineer who had dismantled himself and the chilling, bloody message he had left behind. The silence is coming. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an inevitability. To surrender was to be erased. To fight was to become a monster. He looked at the vast, silent ship of the enemy, a hole in reality, and then back at the aging, compassionate face of Elder Lyra. He thought of the myths he had curated, the stories of humanity's terrible power, and for the first time, he believed them. They had not been penitent keepers. They had been sleeping dragons, guarding a fire that could burn the galaxy. "Take me to the engine," Kaylin said, his voice steady, the cold resolve of a man walking to his own execution. They led him deep into the station's core, through bulkheads that had been sealed for centuries, into a vast, spherical chamber that hummed with contained power. In the center, suspended in a web of energy conduits, was the Noctis engine. It was a perfect sphere of polished, black obsidian, its surface shifting with faint, internal light. A single interface cradle stood before it, a throne of cold, black metal. As he approached, he could feel the dormant consciousness within the sphere, a mind of cold iron and burning stars. The ghost of Admiral Kane, waiting. He could feel the Salenti outside, pressing against the hull, against his mind, eager for the feast. He sat in the cradle, the metal cold against his skin. Lyra placed a hand on his shoulder, her own mind a small, warm candle against the roaring psychic storm. "The light has failed," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Let the darkness fear your voice." Kalen closed his eyes, took a final breath of the world he knew, and lowered the neural interface helmet over his head. The last thing he saw before the world dissolved into light and sound was Lyra's face, etched with both hope and terror. Then, a new voice echoed in the core of his being, a voice like grinding glaciers and shattered worlds, the voice of the Admiral. "So, the Little Keeper has come to wake the ghosts of war. Are you ready to learn how to scream?" The psychic roar of the Salenti was answered by a cold, sharp, and utterly human fury. And in the silent heart of the Candlewood, the engine of night began to wake. The transition was not a feeling of movement but of arrival, as if the universe had been stripped away and replaced with a single, cold, and absolute reality. Kalen found himself standing on the command deck of a warship, a place he had only ever seen in the corrupted schematics of the archive. It was a cathedral of gray metal and holographic light. The view screen, a vast window, looking out not on the familiar purple swirls of the Seraphim Nebula, but on the hard, diamond-sharp glitter of 1,000 alien suns. The air was frigid, tasting of ozone and sterile power. Before him, seated in a command throne that was more weapon than chair, was a man. He was not a ghost or a hologram, but a being of pure, undiluted presence, his form cast in the hard lines of a lifetime of war. He wore the black and crimson uniform of a Terran Dominion admiral, his face a mask of cold fury and ancient weariness. This was Valerius Kane, the architect of Kalen's world and the monster in its heart. So, the librarian presumes to wield the sword. Kane's voice wasn't sound, but a direct imprint on Kalen's consciousness. Each word a shard of ice. You feel the silence at your door, so you come to me, the butcher, to do your dirty work. You are soft. You are the product of 500 years of peace, a peace I built for you on a throne of screaming minds. You are not worthy of this engine. Prove me wrong. The world dissolved and reformed. Kalen was no longer on the bridge, but in the body of a platoon commander on the surface of a blasted alien world. The sky was a sickly green, and the air was thick with the stench of chemical fires. His soldiers, men and women whose faces he somehow knew intimately, huddled behind shattered rock formations as plasma fire rained down from unseen enemies. He felt their fear, their desperate hope, their trust in him. He had their lives in his hands, and he had no idea what to do. His mind, trained in history and theory, froze in the face of raw, chaotic violence. Kane's voice was a merciless goad in his mind. They are waiting for your command. Archivist. Do you catalog their deaths or prevent them? Kalen hesitated, trying to apply logic to a situation that defied it, searching for a perfect moral solution where none existed. That hesitation cost him everything. A concussive blast threw him from his feet, And when he looked up, his platoon was gone, replaced by a field of scorched armor and cooling flesh. He felt not just the sight of their deaths, but the psychic echo of their final moments, the terror, the betrayal, the sudden, shocking emptiness. The simulation ended, and he was back on the bridge, the phantom pain of a dozen shattered lives echoing in his soul. Kane looked at him with undisguised contempt. Sentiment is a luxury the dying cannot afford. You mourned them. A commander mourns his losses after the war is won, not during the battle. You failed. Back on the Candlewood, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Silenti were no longer content to whisper from the void. Their non-ships, the patches of absolute blackness, had reached the station's hull. They did not dock or breach it with weapons. They simply began to phase through it. Crew members watched in horror as sections of bulkhead became translucent, shifting like smoke, before a wave of pure psychic cold washed through the corridor, leaving every person in its path standing motionless, their minds scooped clean. Elder Lyra stood on the Central Command dais, a lone figure of defiance in a room of slowly freezing statues. She could feel the Silenti's presence now as a physical weight, a crushing pressure that sought to unmake her very sense of self. She watched the biomonitors connected to Kalen's cradle. His heart rate was a frantic, chaotic rhythm, his brain activity a raging storm. He was in agony, his body convulsing against its restraints. She had sent a boy into a fight with a god of war, and she feared the battle would destroy him long before he could ever face the true enemy. She dispatched the last few security teams who still had the will to move. Not to fight the intruders, there was nothing to shoot but to form a perimeter around the engine chamber, to buy Kalen whatever time they could with their sanity and their lives. They were the final wall, the last coherent thoughts standing between the Silenti and the Noctis engine. Inside the mindscape, Kane was relentless. He threw Kalen into one simulation after another, each one more impossible than the last. Kalen was forced to order a retreat that left 1,000 civilians to die to save a transport carrying vital intelligence. He had to execute one of his own officers for insubordination to maintain discipline during a failing planetary evacuation. He had to sacrifice a crippled cruiser, detonating its reactor to destroy 2 enemy dreadnoughts. And Kane made him feel the final taste and searing thoughts of every one of the 5,000 crew members aboard as they were vaporized. Each choice chipped away at the archivist, the gentle scholar who believed in preservation and knowledge. The lines between right and wrong blurred into a bloody, pragmatic calculus of survival. He began to learn Kane's brutal arithmetic. He stopped seeing soldiers and started seeing assets. He stopped weighing morality and started calculating odds. The hesitation that had doomed his first command was burned away, replaced by a cold, swift decisiveness. He learned to cut off a limb to save the body, to sacrifice a piece on the board to protect the king. He was changing, his mind being reforged in the fires of simulated war. The transformation terrified him as much as the Silenti. During a lull between the torturous lessons, a moment of reprieve on the cold bridge of the ghost ship, Kalen fought back. Why? He projected at Kane, his own mental voice now harder, sharper. Why are you doing this? You could just give me control. You could fight them yourself through me. Kane's image seemed to flicker, a moment of profound sadness crossing his iron features before it was locked away again. Because this engine does not just broadcast a weapon, boy, it broadcasts a will. The scream must be shaped by a mind that understands why it must be used. When you activate this engine, you will not be a soldier following orders. You will be the one giving the command, a command that will echo across creation. You must have the strength to bear that sin. I failed that test once. My guilt and rage made the scream a blunt, shattering axe when it should have been a scalpel. I committed genocide because I let my hate command me. You must be better than me. You must be a commander, but you must not become a monster. Suddenly, the bridge around them wavered, and the pressure of the Salenti world outside intruded. A wave of suffocating silence and blissful oblivion. On the Candlewood, the final perimeter had been breached. The security officers stood frozen at their posts, weapons lowered, their faces serene. The Salenti were now pouring into the core chamber, waves of invisible, psychic force converging on the Noctis engine. Lyra stood before Kalen's cradle, her mind the last flickering candle in a hurricane. She could feel them, their collective consciousness, a being of infinite patience and hunger. It spoke to her, not in words, but in feelings, offering her peace, an end to the struggle, a gentle merging with the silent, eternal whole. For a moment, she felt her will begin to dissolve. The promise was so seductive. No more fear, no more grief, just quiet. But then she looked at Kalen's straining, unconscious form, at the sacrifice this young man was making, and her resolve hardened into a diamond shield. "You will not have him," she whispered into the psychic storm, her own mind a defiant scream against the crushing silence. The Salenti's attention focused on her, the full weight of their consciousness descending. Kane felt the intrusion. His eyes narrowed. They are here. The lesson is over. Now comes the test. The mindscape shattered. Kalen was no longer on the bridge, but adrift in a sea of pure memory. Kane's memories. He saw the Dominion in its glory, 1,000 worlds linked by light and commerce. He saw the first contact with the Salenti, the confusion, the horror as entire colonies simply went silent. And then he saw what the Salenti did to a world. Kane showed him the planet of Cygnus X1, a world of billions. He saw it from orbit, a jewel of blue and white. And then he was on the surface, walking through its cities. The people were still there, all of them. They sat in their homes, stood in the streets, worked at their consoles, but their eyes were vacant, their minds gone. There was no destruction, no blood, no signs of a struggle. There was only the great quiet, a world of 11 billion living statues, their consciousnesses consumed, their bodies left to slowly run down and die like abandoned machines. He saw children on a playground, frozen mid-swing, their faces still etched with the ghosts of laughter. He saw a mother holding her baby, both staring into nothing. It was an atrocity so profound, so absolute, that it transcended all concepts of war. It was the complete and utter erasure of a people's soul. Kalen felt a rage ignite within him, a cold, pure fury that was not his own, but one he now fully shared. It was the rage of Valerius Kane, the rage of a man who had seen the end of all things and had sworn to do anything to stop it. He understood now. He understood the need for the Noctis engine. He understood the terrible necessity of the scream. He looked at the ghost of the Admiral, who now stood beside him in the silent, dead city. "I'm ready," Kalen projected, his voice no longer that of an archivist, but of a conductor. Kane nodded once, a gesture of grim approval and shared destiny. "Then let us make music together." Back in the core chamber of the Candlewood, Lyra fell to her knees, blood trickling from her nose as the Salenti's full power bore down on her. The psychic roar was deafening, the promise of oblivion irresistible. But just as her consciousness began to fray, a new sound entered the storm. It was not a sound in the air, but a sound in the soul. A single, pure, resonant note that began to emanate from the black sphere of the Noctis engine. The obsidian surface of the engine began to glow, first with a soft and a blue light, then brighter and brighter, until it was a miniature star of pure, psychic energy. The waves of the Silenti's power faltered, their psychic assault wavering as if in confusion, even fear. The pressure on Lyra's mind lessened. She looked up, hope and terror warring in her heart. Kalen's body was still, but the monitors showed his brain waves had synchronized into a single, terrifyingly powerful, coherent pattern. He was no longer just Kalen. He and the ghost of Cain were one, a single will guiding a weapon of unimaginable power. The conductor was formed. The first note of the scream had been sounded, a warning to the silence that humanity was about to remember its own terrible voice. The real battle was about to begin. The single note emanating from the Noctis engine was not an attack. It was a declaration. It was the sound of a predator clearing its throat. A dissonant chord struck in the heart of the Silenti's silent symphony. For the first time in millennia, the hive mind felt something akin to surprise. Their psychic advance on the Candlewood halted, the waves of mental force receding like a tide drawn back by an unseen moon. Inside the engine, Kalen and Cain were a dyad, two minds linked in a state of perfect, terrifying synergy. Kalen was the conduit, his living, agile mind providing the raw psychic energy and the moral compass. However battered it had become, Cain was the weapon, his centuries of tactical genius and ruthless pragmatism shaping that energy into a coherent, directed force. They were not two voices in one head, but a single, integrated consciousness, a fusion of scholar and soldier. They are listening. Cain's thought was a cold, sharp blade in their shared mind. They are tasting our consciousness, trying to understand what has changed. They have never encountered unified resistance at this level. They are accustomed to consuming the scattered, panicked thoughts of individuals, not a fortress. The bridge of the ghost ship was their battleground now, the star-dusted view screen showing them not space, but the psychic landscape of the Silenti's collective mind. It was a vast, gray, featureless ocean of placid thought, the stolen consciousnesses of trillions of beings merged into a single, passionless whole. There were no individuals, no dissent, no pain, only an endless, placid, and horrifying peace. This is what they offer. Kalen felt a wave of revulsion. The end of suffering by the end of self. It is the ultimate entropy. Cain added, and we are the agents of chaos. Prepare yourself. We will not give them time to adapt. We strike now. We will not use the full scream. Not yet. That is a weapon of last resort. First, we will show them that we can hurt them. We will introduce them to a concept they have forgotten: pain. Kalen focused his will, drawing on the near-infinite power of the Noctis engine. Cain shaped it, forging a psychic spear of pure, concentrated emotion. They didn't use anger or hate. Cain knew that was the path to the madness that had consumed him once before. Instead, they chose something far more alien to the Silenti mind, a feeling so quintessentially individual that the hive mind would have no defense against it. Grief. They broadcast a single, piercing memory, Kalen's memory of the moment he first saw the empty, soulless faces of his crewmates, the friends he had shared meals with, the people he had known his entire life, their minds stolen, their inner light extinguished. It was a memory of profound, personal loss, of love turned to ash. They aimed this spear of sorrow not at the whole of the Salenti mind, but at one of the black voids that was still partially phased through the Candlewood's hull. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. On the psychic plane, a violent, purple storm erupted in the tranquil gray ocean of the Silenti consciousness. For the first time, a part of the collective whole was ripped away from the rest, isolated and force-fed an emotion it could not comprehend. In the physical world, the patch of absolute blackness convulsed. The serene void shimmered, then fractured like breaking glass. From the non-ship, a soundless scream of pure agony tore through the psychic spectrum. Crew members who had been standing frozen in its path collapsed, clutching their heads, not because they were being attacked, but because they were caught in the psychic shrapnel of a dying god. The Salenti vessel did not explode, it simply dissolved, its coherency lost, its purpose shattered. It vanished not into nothingness, but into a shower of faint, glittering motes of light, like dust catching a sunbeam. On the command dais, Elder Lyra stared in awe. One of them, they had destroyed one of them. Hope, a feeling she thought had been extinguished, ignited in her chest like a nova. She watched as, all over the station, people began to stir. The hold the Salenti had on their minds was weakening. The psychic roar was being drowned out by the engine's rising song. Voices returned. Consciousness returned. The Candlewood was waking up. It worked. Kalen's thought was a mix of triumph and horror. He had felt the Salenti entity's death, the fragmentation of thousands, perhaps millions, of stolen minds as they were violently severed from the collective. It was a victory, but it felt like a massacre. Do not grieve for them. Kane's voice was cold iron, pulling him back from the brink of empathy. You are not killing people. You are liberating them from a prison. Those motes of light, they are the echoes of the consciousnesses that thing had consumed. We have not destroyed them. We have set them free. Now, again, hit them while they are in disarray. Kalen and Kane went on the offensive. They became a psychic scalpel, carving through the Salenti's psychic fleet. They didn't need to see the enemy ships. They could feel their cold, hungry presence in the void. They forged new weapons from the armory of human emotion. They broadcast focused waves of defiant hope, the memory of a child's first steps, a concept so illogical and forward-looking that it acted like a corrosive acid on the Salenti's stagnant, timeless consciousness. They used pure, unadulterated joy, the memory of a lover's embrace, the taste of a first snow, and it overloaded the placid minds of the Salenti like a surge of electricity. Each strike was a precision masterpiece, a surgical application of feeling to destroy an enemy that had none. One by one, the black voids that had swarmed the Candlewood fractured and dissolved, releasing their captured souls into the void as glittering dust. The psychic roar that had besieged the station for weeks was replaced by a symphony of resonant power, the song of the Noctis engine. The crew of the Candlewood rallied. Engineers, their minds now clear, raced to reinforce the station's power grids, feeding more energy to the core. Medical teams rushed to aid those still recovering from the psychic assault. The station, once a tomb, was now a buzzing hive of determined activity, its people united by a single purpose to fuel the weapon that was saving them. But the Salenti were not a disorganized rabble. They were a galactic-level intelligence, and they were learning. They stopped their individual assaults and began to regroup, their remaining voids coalescing at a distance. They had met a new force, and they were adapting their strategy. On the Ghost Bridge, the psychic ocean on the view screen grew calm again, but it was a different kind of calm. It was no longer placid and gray, but dark and deep, like the ocean floor. The Silenti were shielding themselves, learning to dampen the emotional frequencies Kalen and Kane were using against them. "They are building a wall," Kane observed, his mental voice laced with a grudging respect. "They are learning to ignore us. They are isolating the part of their consciousness that we can touch. They are preparing a counterattack." "What can they do?" Kalen asked, feeling a chill despite the power thrumming through him. "We are in their minds." "Do not be arrogant, boy. We are a virus in their nervous system, and they are developing an antibody. They cannot attack us with emotion, but they can attack us with its opposite. Logic. Pure, cold, absolute reason." The psychic landscape shifted. From the dark ocean floor, a single, perfect, crystalline structure began to grow. It was a lattice of geometric perfection, a construct of pure mathematics and flawless logic. It radiated an aura of such profound order that it felt like a physical blow. It was the antithesis of everything Kalen and Kane had been using. It was a weapon made of certainty. The crystalline lattice pulsed, and in their shared mind, Kalen and Kane felt its attack. It did not try to overwhelm them with feeling. It sought to dismantle them. It projected a single, irrefutable logical proof, the argument that individual consciousness was a statistical anomaly, an inefficient and flawed state of being destined for self-destruction. It argued that the ultimate state of all energy and information was equilibrium, a state of perfect, ordered silence. It argued that their resistance was not noble, but a chaotic, meaningless spasm against the inevitable heat death of the universe. It was a philosophical attack, a weapon that killed not with force, but with despair. Kalen felt his will begin to crumble. The logic was flawless. His own scholarly mind, trained to respect reason and proof, could find no flaw in the Silenti's argument. The emotions he had been wielding, hope, joy, grief, suddenly seemed like nothing more than random, chaotic neural firings in the face of such perfect, cold order. His sense of self, his belief in the value of his own life and the lives of his crew began to feel like a childish delusion. He was a flicker of irrationality in a universe of cold, hard numbers. "Do not listen." Kane's voice was a roar, a bulwark of pure, stubborn will against the tide of logic. This is how they win. They don't conquer you. They convince you to surrender. They make you erase yourself. But Kane was struggling too. His military mind, while decisive, was also built on a framework of order and strategy. The Silenti's logic was a poison that targeted the very foundations of his tactical genius. If all struggle was ultimately pointless, why fight? If the end was inevitable, why delay it? The connection between them began to fray. The synergy that had made them so powerful, now threatened by an enemy that had found their one true weakness, their own intelligence. Kalen felt himself slipping, the warmth of his individuality fading. The cold peace of the Silenti's logic offering a strange, seductive comfort. He saw his life, his history, his love for his people, as nothing more than a rounding error in the grand cosmic equation. Surrender was not just easy, it was rational. But as his consciousness teetered on the edge of dissolution, a new feeling broke through the cold logic. It was not an emotion he had wielded as a weapon. It was something deeper, something Kane's brutal simulations had forged in him. It was stubbornness. It was the irrational, illogical, and utterly human refusal to lie down and die. It was the spirit of an ancestor who had stood against a charging beast with nothing but a sharp rock and a scream of defiance. It was the sheer, bloody-minded, unreasonable will to exist. No, Kalen projected a single, defiant thought that was not logical, not emotional, but simply a statement of fact. I am, therefore, I fight. That single, irrational spark of defiance was enough. It was a flaw in the Silenti's perfect logic, a variable they had not accounted for. The crystalline lattice flickered. Cain seized the opportunity. Now, boy, give them chaos, not the chaos of emotion, but the chaos of life itself. Give them everything at once. Together, they unleashed the full, unfiltered spectrum of the human experience. They didn't shape it or aim it. They simply opened the floodgates of the Noctis engine and poured a raw, chaotic torrent of life into the cold, ordered mind of the Silenti. They broadcast birth and death, love and betrayal, creation and destruction, poetry and madness, a billion contradictory, illogical, and beautiful moments of existence all at once. It was not an attack, it was an infection. The perfect crystalline logic of the Silenti construct shattered under the onslaught of sheer, unadulterated, and gloriously messy life. The dark ocean of their mind boiled, the ordered silence replaced by a cacophony of a billion new, individual thoughts. Back on the Candlewood, the crew watched as the remaining Silenti voids began to writhe and twist, their perfect blackness corrupted with bursts of chaotic light. They were no longer a unified fleet. They were a collective mind having a seizure, their tranquil consensus shattered by the introduction of individuality. They began to flee, their void streaking away from the station and vanishing into the depths of the nebula. Not in a coordinated retreat, but in a panicked, disorganized rout. For the first time in 500 years, the space around the Candlewood was empty. The psychic storm had passed. A trembling, fragile silence descended, but this time it was not the silence of the enemy. It was the silence of victory. In the core chamber, the light of the Noctis engine faded, its song quieting to a low hum. Kalen's body slumped in the interface cradle, his vital signs stabilizing. Lyra rushed to his side, her heart pounding. The battle was won, but as she looked at Kalen's peaceful, sleeping face, a new and terrible question began to form in her mind. They had driven off the Silenti, but they had done so by waking a ghost and unleashing a power that had once broken the galaxy. The engine was awake now. The scream had been sounded, and in the depths of space, other, older things than the Silenti might have been listening. The war for the Candlewood was over. The war for humanity's future had just begun. The silence that followed the Silenti's retreat was heavier than the psychic storm that had preceded it. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of shed identities and the hum of a newly awakened god in the heart of their home. Kalen awoke in the medcore, the crisp, sterile white of the ceiling, a stark contrast to the chaotic mindscape he had inhabited. He felt hollow. The thundering presence of Valerius Cain was gone from his mind, but the Admiral had not left without leaving echoes. Kalen's thoughts felt sharper, colder, more analytical. When he looked at a nurse, he instinctively calculated her fatigue level and combat readiness. When he saw the schematics of the station on a nearby monitor, he instantly identified 3 structural weaknesses and a dozen tactical blind spots. The archivist was still there, but now he shared his skull with a soldier, and the soldier was always on duty. Elder Lyra was at his bedside, her face a relief map of exhaustion and relief. "You did it, Kalen," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved us." "We saved us," he corrected, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth it once held. He sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed, his movements precise and economical. He was not the same man who had walked into the core chamber. That man was a casualty of a war no one else had seen. "Status report," he said, the words feeling foreign and yet perfectly natural on his tongue. Lyra, taken aback by his tone but understanding its source, complied. The Candlewood had suffered 0 casualties in terms of life, but the psychic toll was immense. Nearly a quarter of the population was in recovery, their minds bruised and shaken from the Silenti's touch. The station itself was undamaged, but the Noctis engine was now in a new state. It was no longer dormant, it was on standby, humming with a low-level psychic resonance that every soul on the station could feel at the edge of their hearing, a constant reminder of the power they now possessed. News of their victory spread through the station, not with joyous celebration, but with a somber, fearful reverence. Kalen was no longer just an archivist. He was the conductor, the man who had spoken with the voice of their ancestors and driven back the darkness. When he walked through the corridors, people fell silent, their gazes a mixture of awe, gratitude, and a deep, instinctual fear. He was their savior, but he was also the living embodiment of the weapon that terrified them. A new council was convened, and this time Kalen was not an advisor but a central figure. The old questions of maintenance schedules and crop yields were replaced by a single, terrifying question. What now? They had a weapon of unimaginable power, a weapon their ancestors had deemed too dangerous to exist. The Silenti had fled, but they were not destroyed. They were a galactic force, and the Candlewood was a single, stationary lighthouse. They had won a battle, but the war for survival was far from over. The council was divided. One faction, led by a cautious engineer named Boren, argued for decommissioning the engine. "We have survived," he urged, his voice trembling. "We have proven we can defend ourselves. But to keep this scream active is to invite disaster. It is a beacon, not a lighthouse for lost ships, but a dinner bell for monsters. The Silenti found us. What else will hear its song?" Another faction, led by a hardened security chief named Anya, argued the opposite. "Decommission it. Are you mad?" she countered, her hand resting on the butt of her sidearm. "That engine is the only reason we are still here. The Silenti are not gone. They are regrouping. They will be back. And they will have adapted. To disarm ourselves now would be suicide. We should not be hiding. We should be hunting. We should take this weapon and end the threat, once and for all." The debate raged for days, tearing at the fragile unity of the newly freed crew. It was the age-old conflict of humanity, the farmer versus the hunter, the shield versus the sword. Kalen listened to it all, his face an unreadable mask. He felt the logic in both arguments, the scholar in him understanding Boren's fear of unintended consequences, the soldier forged by Kane agreeing with Anya's aggressive pragmatism. His chance to weigh in came when he was asked to interface with the engine's archives again, not to fight, but to learn. He was to delve into Kane's memories and the Dominion's history to understand the full scope of the Silenti threat. He agreed, but he did so with a heavy heart. He was afraid of what else he would find in the Admiral's mind, afraid of the pieces of Kane that still resonated within his own soul. He sat in the cradle once more, but this time the experience was different. There was no resistance, no torturous simulations. The ghost of Kane was not a warden, but a librarian, guiding him through the vast, cold library of his memories. Kalen saw the full history of the Mind Wars. He learned that the Silenti were not conquerors. They were, in their own twisted way, saviors. They were an ancient race who had witnessed countless civilizations rise, war, and annihilate themselves. They had come to believe that individual consciousness, with its chaotic emotions and conflicting desires, was a universal plague, the root of all suffering. Their solution was the silence of forced, peaceful absorption into their collective, an end to strife by an end to the self. They were not evil, they were a terrible, compassionate mercy. He also learned the full, horrifying truth of the scream. Cain showed him the final battle, the attack on the Silenti's core world. The Noctis engine, mounted on Cain's flagship. The final word had not just broadcast a psychic frequency, it had become a siphon. It had not just shattered the hive mind, it had absorbed the consciousness of every Silenti on that world, trillions of minds, and compressed them into the engine's core matrix. The engine was not just a weapon, it was a prison. The immense power Kalen had wielded was drawn from the compressed, tortured consciousness of the very species they were fighting. Their ancestors had not just committed genocide, they had weaponized the souls of their victims. This revelation shattered Kalen. The moral high ground he thought they stood on crumbled into a pit of cosmic horror. They were fighting monsters by using an engine powered by the tortured ghosts of their enemies' ancestors. The weight of this sin was a physical thing, threatening to crush his sanity. He felt a profound, debilitating guilt, a shame that transcended his own actions and stained his entire species. He staggered out of the core chamber, the knowledge a poison in his veins. He could barely look at his own people, seeing them now not as survivors, but as the inheritors of an unspeakable crime. He sequestered himself, refusing to speak to the council, refusing to see Lyra. The soldier in his mind screamed at him for his weakness, while the archivist wept for their lost innocence. It was during this dark night of the soul that the Candlewood received a message. It was not psychic, not from the Silenti. It was a simple, old-fashioned radio signal, broadcast on a tightly focused beam, a signal that could only have come from a human ship. The message was short, its computerized voice crisp and clear. Dominion vessel Candlewood. This is Terran Reconnaissance Cutter Vigil. We detected a high-energy psychic resonance from this sector. Cease your broadcast immediately. You are in violation of the Armistice of Sol. Identify your commanding officer. We are coming to take you into custody. The message sent a shockwave through the station. They were not alone. After 500 years, they had been found. But their saviors were not coming with open arms. They were coming with accusations and threats. The Terran Reconnaissance Cutter was a military vessel. The Armistice of Sol was a treaty they had never heard of. It seemed that while they had been sleeping, a new human civilization had risen from the ashes of the old. A civilization that had clearly outlawed the very technology that had just saved them. The council was thrown into chaos. Anya's faction saw the message as a threat. Who are they to give us orders, she demanded. We are the true inheritors of the Dominion. They are children, playing with rules we wrote in blood. We should prepare to fight. Boren's faction saw it as a desperate hope. This is our chance, he pleaded. A chance to rejoin humanity, to let them deal with this curse. We must comply. We must shut down the engine and surrender it to them. The decision fell to Kalen. He was the only one who could truly operate the engine, the only one who understood the full depth of their situation. He emerged from his isolation, his face grim, his eyes holding the cold light of a distant star. He walked into the council chamber, the soldier and the scholar within him having finally reached their own terrible armistice. We will not fight them, he said, his voice ringing with an authority that silenced all debate. And we will not surrender. They do not understand what this engine is. They do not understand the enemy we face. They see a weapon, I see a key. We have been the keepers of a prison for 500 years, living a lie to atone for a sin we didn't even know we had committed. He turned to the main view screen, which now showed a single, small, fast-moving contact approaching their position, the Vigil. The Silenti are not just an enemy to be destroyed. They are a question that must be answered. And this engine, it's not just a weapon. Kane showed me. It can not only broadcast, it can receive, it can translate. For the first time, and we have the ability not just to scream at the silence, but to listen to it. He looked at the shocked faces of the council members, his gaze lingering on Lyra. Our ancestors chose to end a war with an atrocity. They chose silence over understanding. I will not make that same mistake. We will meet this new humanity, but we will meet them on our terms, and we will prepare for the return of the Silenti. But this time, our goal will not be annihilation. Me. He took a deep breath, the full weight of his decision settling upon him. It will be communication. The archivist had found his purpose again, not in preserving the past, but in trying to build a future that was not doomed to repeat it. He was no longer just the conductor of the scream. He intended to become the translator of the silence. But as the vigil grew closer, a sleek, gray predator of a ship bristling with weapon emplacements, Kalen knew that convincing this new, militant humanity of his peaceful intentions might be a harder battle than the one he had fought against the Silenti. He had saved his people from one enemy, only to place them in the path of another, their own brothers. The Terran reconnaissance cutter Vigil was a blade of a ship, a sleek, gray predator built for speed and surgical strikes. It hung in the void before the Candlewood, a stark contrast of new and old. The Vigil was a scalpel, while the station was a colossal, ancient fist. Aboard the Candlewood's command dais, the crew watched the approaching vessel with a mixture of hope and dread. They had been found, but they were also being judged. A crisp, authoritative voice cut through the station's comms, the face of its speaker appearing on the main view screen. She was a woman in her prime, her dark hair pulled back in a severe military bun, her eyes the color of hard steel. The insignia on her collar identified her as Captain Eva Rostova, commander of the Vigil. "This is your final warning, Candlewood." Rostova's voice was calm, but carried the implicit threat of overwhelming force. "Power down the psychic resonant device. Our scans confirm it is a Noctis-class weapon, the use of which is an act of galactic treason under the armistice. A containment team is preparing to board. Comply, or we will enforce the treaty." Kalen stepped forward, his own face appearing before Rostova. He looked nothing like a commander. He was a young man in a simple keeper's tunic, his face pale and weary, yet his gaze was as unyielding as her own. "Captain Rostova," he began, his voice steady, carrying the weight of the last few days. "We are the crew of the Candlewood. We are not your enemy. The device you speak of is the Noctis engine. And yes, it is the weapon you think it is. But you are arriving at the end of a war you know nothing about." He proceeded to tell her everything. He spoke of the Silenti, not as monsters, but as a force of cosmic entropy. He explained their method, the slow, gentle erasure of entire civilizations. And then, his voice dropping, he told her the truth he had learned from Kane, the horrific secret of the engine's power source. He told her that the ghosts of the Silenti's own ancestors were trapped within its core, their eternal agony used to fuel the scream. On the bridge of the Vigil, Rostova and her crew listened in stunned silence. Their history books spoke of the mind wars in stark, clinical terms, a dark age of psychic terror ended by the Dominion's ultimate, unspecified weapons, leading to the strict laws of the armistice. They had always imagined the Noctis engine as a bomb. They had never conceived of it as a prison, a monument to a sin so profound it had been erased from history. "Your story is compelling, Conductor Kalen," Rostova said, her composure regained, though a flicker of doubt had entered her eyes. But it changes nothing. The law is absolute. That weapon is a threat to every sentient mind in this quadrant. It must be contained. To contain it is to preserve the sin. Kalen countered, his voice rising with a passion he thought he had lost. To decommission, it is to forget it, to allow the cycle to begin again someday. There is a third option, atonement. Before Rostova could demand he explain, alarms blared across the bridges of both the Vigil and the Candlewood. The space around them was changing. It wasn't the arrival of ships, not the pinprick voids of before. A section of the nebula, vast enough to swallow a sun, was simply vanishing. It was being replaced by a wound in reality, a rift of absolute, non-reflective blackness that tore at the edges of space-time. From it pulsed a wave of psychic pressure so immense it made the previous attack feel like a whisper. The core of the Silenti hive mind had arrived. It was not here to feed. It was here to sterilize the source of its pain. "What is that?" Rostova's voice was tight, her military calm finally cracking in the face of something so far beyond her experience. "The silence itself," Kalen answered grimly. "They have adapted. They will not be baited or tricked this time. They are here to erase this entire sector." The Vigil's weapon systems were useless. Firing on the rift was like shooting bullets at a hurricane. Rostova watched her tactical display as the rift began to expand, its edge of nothingness slowly advancing. They had minutes, perhaps less, before their reality was unwritten. "Kalen," Lyra's voice was a whisper at his side. "Can you fight it?" He shook his head, his gaze locked on the approaching abyss. "We cannot win by screaming louder. Cain's way was the way of war, of annihilation. It only led to this, an escalation of pain across 500 years. He turned to the comms panel, his eyes finding Rostovez again. "Captain, I am going back to the engine. I am not going to fight them. I am going to talk to them. I need you to trust me. Order your ship to stand down and lower its energy shields. Any hostile energy will be seen as aggression." For Rostova, it was an impossible choice: trust a rogue archivist with a soul-powered superweapon, or adhere to her orders and be erased. In her eyes, Kalen saw the same brutal calculus he had learned under Kane's tutelage. She was a soldier, and she recognized the moment when the rulebook had to be thrown into the fire. "Do it," she said, her voice a clipped command. To her own crew, she ordered, "All systems to stand by. Lower the shields. Let's see what the librarian has to say." Kalen ran, not to the command dais, but back to the cold and silent heart of the station. He strapped himself into the cradle one last time, the metal no longer feeling alien, but like a part of him. As the helmet descended, he closed his eyes, but he did not call on the ghost of the Admiral. He reached past the soldier, past the rage and the tactics, and into the core of the engine itself, to the sea of imprisoned Silenti souls. He did not seek to weaponize their pain. He sought to understand it. He opened the floodgates, but not outward. He let the trillions of trapped minds flood into his own. He experienced their last moments, the horror of the first scream, the agony of being torn from their collective and compressed into a living battery. He felt their ancient, unified consciousness, their sorrow at the universe's endless violence, and the cold, compassionate logic that had led them to their terrible solution. He did not just see their history, he became it. Then, with the last ounce of his will, the archivist at the core of his being took all of that pain, all of that history, all of that horror, and he translated it. He shaped it not into a scream, but into a message. He took the voices of the imprisoned ghosts and formed them into a single, coherent story, their story. From the Noctis engine, a new broadcast emanated, It was not a wave of grief or joy, but a complex, silent transmission of pure information, of memory. It was humanity handing the Silenti back their own lost past. He projected it directly into the heart of the approaching rift, a psychic peace offering sent into the teeth of oblivion. The effect was unimaginable. The great wound in space stopped its advance. The crushing psychic pressure wavered, then fractured. Inside the silent, unified mind of the Silenti, a new idea was born: descent. For the first time, the collective was faced with an undeniable truth from its own forgotten ancestors, a truth that shattered the flawless logic of their purpose. They were not saviors, they were the product of trauma, a hive mind born from a psychic atrocity. Their eternal peace, a direct consequence of an eternal, hidden pain. Their crusade to end suffering was powered by the greatest suffering of all. The rift did not attack. It did not flee. It simply remained, a vast, silent witness, its perfect certainty broken forever. And then, slowly, impossibly, it began to recede. It folded in on itself, not with the violence of a collapse, but with the gentle finality of a closing eye, until all that was left was the star-dusted swirl of the Seraphim Nebula. The war was over. In the core chamber, the light of the Noctis engine faded for the last time. The hum of contained power ceased. The trillions of souls within, their story finally told, their suffering finally acknowledged, were at peace. The engine was now just a sphere of cold, black obsidian, its terrible purpose fulfilled. Kalen slumped in the cradle, conscious but utterly drained. The ghosts of two species finally quiet in his mind. In the weeks that followed, a new order was forged in the quiet space by the nebula. Captain Rostova did not take Kalen into custody. The crew of the Vigil, having witnessed the impossible, sent a report back to their high command that would force the new Terran government to rewrite its history books and reconsider the very foundation of its most sacred laws. The Candlewood was no longer a prison or a pariah. It was a nexus, a point of first contact in a new kind of galactic dialogue. Kalen stood on the observation deck, flanked by Elder Lyra and Captain Rostova. The three of them looked out at the swirling clouds where the rift had been. The great beacon at the station's heart had been reignited, but its beam was no longer a lock or a warning. It was a memorial, a promise. "What will you do now?" Rostova asked, her voice softer now, the hard edges of the soldier smoothed by awe. Kalen looked at the inert, silent engine on a nearby schematic. The archivist had won. "The past is never dead," he said quietly. "We just learn how to live with it. We will keep the light burning, not as wardens of a weapon, but as guardians of a memory. The memory that the most monstrous enemy can be born from a wound we inflicted ourselves, and that sometimes the only way to end a war is to be brave enough to listen to the other side's ghosts." And the silence had returned to the space around the Candlewood, but it was a silence of peace, of possibility. The old humanity had left a legacy of wrath and secrets. Now, in the quiet heart of a forgotten nebula, a new humanity, scarred but wiser, had chosen a different path, not to scream into the darkness, but to build a lighthouse in its honor, and to wait, with patience and with hope, for the dawn.